What up, Misfits? Welcome to the Misfit Heroes podcast. My name is Chris, and together we are going on a journey. Now, for the last few weeks, I've been focusing on answering podcasting questions that you all have been asking me, and I'm going to continue that trend. So be sure to ask away down in the comments section below, and I'll get to yours ASAP. One commenter asked how I got started in podcasting, and you guys know how I love talking about myself. I couldn't help to explain why and how I got to where I'm at now on the podcast. And I'm also going to be talking about why I've been doing these episodes in particular, and why I think that you should be doing this podcasting thing too. First, let me talk about why you should consider podcasting in the first place. Now, podcasts are awesome, and a recent survey on listener statistics saw that 78% of Americans are aware of podcasts, and 1/3 of all Americans listen to at least one podcast weekly. Fun fact, globally, the country that has the most podcast listeners is Sweden, with 47% of Swedish people listening to a podcast weekly.
Swedish!
But what about watching a video podcast? How about those numbers? Well, YouTube is the largest video platform in the world for a reason, and the geniuses over at Alphabet Inc. did a study that said 46% of podcast listeners prefer listening to a podcast with video, and that 15% of podcast listeners would pay between $10 to $25 USD to see a podcast live. So why aren't you doing this yet? I want to shed some light on how I've done this from the ground up and give you some expert insight and things that I think you should know about the podcasting space so that you can also jump into the world of video podcasting.
Playing the Misfit Heroes podcast.
Now, first, I want to make one thing very clear. I think everyone should have a podcast, and not just because I love podcasting. Podcasting is, in my opinion, the next step in the evolution of media. For years, I've listened to talk radio and watched the news and listened to people wax and wane their opinions and expertise about every different type of topic under the sun that you could imagine. It seems for the majority of my years, the go-to medium for people to hear about current events was the television. With the advent of cable news networks in the 80s and 90s, these select groups of think tanks started growing so much to where the standard now is that the majority of people who own a home now also own a television. But after nearly a century of watching and listening to other people's opinions on a subject and the mass exodus of communication mediums created by the internet, television has become kind of, well, stale. So why do I think podcasting is the next evolution of media? Well, you can make a podcast about literally anything. Gone are the days of television producers controlling what information can and can't be seen by the masses. YouTubers, social media influencers, and podcasters are the new subject matter experts, and they share and provide ideas that many would never hear or see on the heavily censored and centralized news media. Podcasts are also distinctive. My podcast focuses on people doing good things for others and making the world a better place. I love doing this, and I get to speak to some amazing people doing amazing things that may have never been shared elsewhere outside of my platform. It almost feels like a civic duty to me at times. I mean, where else are you going to hear about some of the stories that you've seen on my show? So that's why I think you should start a video podcast. And I think the best way to show that anyone can and should do this is to show you my humble beginnings. I'm just going to tell you about how I hodgepodge this podcast thing together and how I started from literally zero to where I'm at now. So, how did it start? Well, for starters, I didn't even listen to podcasts until about 2017. I was a little bit late to class there, if I'm being honest. But I quickly became obsessed. I started listening to podcasts on my way to work in the car, and I was hooked. How was what I was hearing on shows like the Joe Rogan Experience, Armchair Expert, and Conan O'Brien Needs a Friend so much more value to me than what I listened to on the radio? And then I got this harebrained idea of starting my own podcast because, hey, anybody can do that, right? I started a small group at my church, and I wondered if anyone else wanted to start a podcast as well. 7 people came to that group, and we all sort of jumped into the idea of starting our own podcasts. When one of my friends from church heard that I was starting one, he literally gave me the equipment I needed. It's kind of a fun story, actually. I had made this Amazon wish list of all the equipment I would need, from mixers to microphones to cords, everything I would need. In total, the cost was going to be close to $2,000, and at the time, I did not have that kind of money to dish out. Honestly, kind of made me pause for a second because I had no earthly idea how I was going to convince my wife to let me put that amount of money on a credit card. My friend was moving and he called me up and he said, "Hey, look, I'm moving. I've got all this audio equipment in my house." He used to be a touring guitarist for some country music artists like Conway Twitty and Waylon Jennings and some others. When I picked everything up and I got back home, the exact equipment that I had placed into that Amazon wish list, literally every single piece, was included in the old equipment that my friend had given me. Not purchased for me, he already had it laying around. Now, I don't know what your faith situation is, but to me, that was a gift from God. I mean, the coincidence is kind of astounding. On top of that, about a week later, one of the people that I had in that small group at church, they called me up and they said, "Hey, there's a spare storage area above my retail business, and I think you could use it for a studio." So now I had a means of recording, I had a place to record, and a plan as to who I was going to speak with. I started messaging people via social media that I saw doing good things in my area, and many of those people agreed to come on my show and hang out with me. And that's literally how I started my podcast. And I know it's been said before, but if I can do this, why can't you? So let's teach you how to do the same thing that I did. And that's why I'm taking a break from interviewing people for a little bit to help give a hand up in the podcasting space, doing these tutorial videos with ways that you may not have thought to do this yourself. Now, I know some of you are sitting there thinking, wow, that's great that you had people give you a whole bunch of equipment and locations and stuff, but what's that got to do with me? I don't have anything. Well, I want to share a thought with you real quick. The most difficult thing that I find about being a podcaster has nothing to do with what equipment I use or how to make myself sound or look better on video or how to even promote my podcast. All the things you would think that a podcaster would tell you how to do. The most difficult thing about podcasting for me is consistency. I release a new episode every 2 weeks, and if I'm being real, sometimes I just don't feel like it. This endeavor puts a lot on someone, and it can totally feel like a grind at times, especially when it's just one person having to constantly come up with new content ideas, guests to interview, and new ways of promoting your podcast. It can be a lot, but don't make your podcast about podcasting. The best piece of advice that I can give to anyone starting a podcast is this: do it because you love talking and sharing what you're talking about with others. If you focus on your passion, the right people will find you, and the community of people that enjoy your content is going to show up. It's been over 4 years now, and I still love it. I've been featured in the top 200 of Apple Podcasts. I've spoken at podcasting events. I've even been featured in magazines and blog articles. I now average about 50,000 people viewing my podcast on YouTube per month. And all of this is kind of crazy to me because in my mind, I'm just some dude. But at the core of it all, I've had DMs about how people love that I'm sharing stories of hope and bringing positivity to their daily lives. So that's why I do this, and that's why I think you should too. Every single one of you watching or listening to this has life experiences and passions that you want to share with the world. So let's make that happen. You can do it, and if you've been thinking about doing it, I am here to help you in any way that I can. And that is the end of my pep talk for you this week. It's time to start working on your podcast. So take a look at my other videos and episodes on how to start your own podcast, and let's grow together. If you have any questions whatsoever, be sure to comment down below, and I'll answer in as much detail as I know how. If this podcast helped you out at all, please like and subscribe, and be sure to leave a rating and review of the show on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. As always, thank you so much for listening. Truly, I love you. And until next time, be kind, love one another, and be a hero.